Okay, we're back with part 6 of chapter 6. We're going to take our optimal diagram that took into account the cost of precaution and the benefits from precaution, which is reduce the probability of an accident, so that's the payoff. And now we're going to figure out what is the optimal thing to do under different liability standards. So we have everything from no liability, where it's entirely on the victim, strict liability, where things are entirely on the injurer. We're going to have joint liability, comparative liability. We'll look at all of those variations a little bit later. I want to focus right now on understanding what is the optimal thing from the victim's perspective. If we have no liability and strict liability, what is the optimal thing to do from the perspective of the injurer when we have no liability and strict liability? I'm going through this a little slowly here so you grab it and you can understand exactly what is the best thing to do under these kind of extreme circumstances, and then we'll make the analysis a little more realistic as we take some complications into account and get somewhere in between the two extremes of no liability and strict liability. So let's start with no liability. This is where the victim bears the cost of precautions and any damages. So anytime that you're at a sporting event, you're at a concert, you're in a circumstance where you buy a ticket and you're not reading the fine print, but it may be saying that the venue bears no responsibility for any harm that may be suffered by the individual. Now, that's what it could say, and of course you could litigate that in court as being unreasonable, misleading, etc., but we're not going to worry about those complications right now. So when we have a situation like this, we're going to start by taking a look at the victim's perspective, no liability, strict liability, and then we'll worry about the injurer. So this is what is going on in the first case. We're going to look from the victim's perspective only. It's our expected social cost relationship, but now I've put subscripts associated with the actions of the victim. So the W times X is going to be WV, which is the cost per unit of precaution by the victim. XV is going to be the amount of precaution undertaken by the victim. And P of X sub V is going to be the probability of an accident depending upon the amount of precaution the victim takes. And A is what A is. That's going to be the average damages associated with an accident. Now, what do you do in this case? This is going to be just like our expected social cost curve that we drew in the last video. You're going to choose a level of precaution X such that the marginal cost of additional precaution and the marginal benefit of additional precaution are going to be equal to each other. Okay, so that kind of makes sense that you're going to act in as prudent a manner as is economically efficient, since the onus is on you as the victim when there is no liability. Okay, so you're trying to avoid the accident. Okay, avoid being the victim of the accident. Okay, now the next part here is going to be how we deal with strict liability when from the perspective of the victim. All right. The expected social cost curve is going to, or relationship is going to change. It's going to be exactly what we had before, but now we're going to subtract the probability of an accident occurring, P of X, V, times D, which is going to be the damage award. Okay, so now you may end up getting hurt, but if you're hurt, strict liability, it's automatically the injurer's fault. Okay, we only have to show causation, and in that case, then you're going to get a damage award, which is going to offset the cost that you've incurred here. If we assume, which sometimes it's a pretty darn reasonable assumption, but not always, that you get a full compensation for any damages that occur. A and D are going to equal each other, okay? Now, in the real world, sometimes you're working on a contingency basis and the plaintiff attorney may be getting 25, a third, 40% of the award. There are other circumstances where you can actually sue for attorney's fees above and beyond an award, so that could in fact make you whole. If in fact you get full compensation, these cancel each other out, so you're only left with the costs equal to WV times XV. And how do you minimize that? By no precaution whatsoever. And so you choose XV equal to 0. So you can see that strict liability on the one hand sounds pretty cool from the plaintiff's perspective, but maybe socially not the best thing because it does not encourage any sort of precaution on behalf of the victim, because they'll be fully compensated. And remember, before the fact, you don't know if you're going to be the victim or the injurer. All right. Now let's continue this by taking a look at both no liability and strict liability from the injurer's perspective. So what is the optimal thing for them to do? The equation's going to be just as we had before, but the subscript now is going to be I for the injurer. And if you can see the first diagram here, or the first equation, I keep calling it a diagram and I have no idea why, is when there is no liability and the expected social cost is going to be simply WI times XI. There's going to be no damage payment because you're not going to be responsible for any accident that occurs. Obviously, you're going to minimize that by choosing 0 level of precaution. Pretty simple. And then finally, we've got strict liability. With strict liability, we've got, we have to take the damage award into account once again, and it's analogous to what we did with no liability for the victim. For the injurer, under strict liability, they have every incentive to take the efficient level of precaution. Okay? So pretty straightforward. Now, let me ask you something. Is no liability always inappropriate? It really depends on who can take precaution. If only the victim can take precaution to avoid an accident, no liability makes sense. If only the injurer can take precaution, strict liability makes sense. If both, some combination will take into account. So that is going to be the next step in all this. I'll let you digest what we have covered. We'll pick that up in part 7.